We begin our mini series on, does the Torah determine what morality is, or do we? Religious belief versus human responsibility. There are a number of challenges with respect to this question, which we aren't going to address right now. I think it's more germane for our purposes at present, in particular given the situation, for us to consider the implications of the various answers that we can propose to this question. And I remind you, in a previous session, without going through any of the source material at any great length, I kind of spilled the beans in noting that the Torah represents one set, morality represents another set, and they overlap, but they aren't identical. And in order to enunciate what serves as the undergirding of that proposition, that they are not identical, I'm first going to invoke something that we already discussed. Indeed, we noted it last time as well. And to me, it is about as subtle as a well-aimed brick in getting across this point. As we noted, when Abraham stands before God and pleads on behalf of the people of Sodom, the thrust of his challenge, because it is veritably a challenge. God forbid that you should do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, and thus the righteous will be like the wicked. God forbid it. And the critical line here is, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Which, as we noted, inexorably dictates that Abraham is saying, I have an inner concept of what constitutes justice. My definition of justice is not simply whatever God does defines justice. No, I have this inner mechanism that defines for me what is just. And God, I'm challenging you to conform to that intuitive definition in my mind. In other words, we have an innate sense of morality, and this is critical. We'll still need to consider of what relevance or what significance is this machinery that we have within ourselves, but we have it. We have an intuitive sense of what constitutes justice, that is, to the extent that I think we can equate the two, what constitutes morality. And it isn't simply a matter of absorbing it from what God does or tells us in the Torah. And that in itself occasions our introducing two terms into our lexicon, which are really critical in this discussion. And that is autonomous morality versus heteronymous morality, which is maybe a somewhat highfalutin way of saying this, but autonomous morality means I don't need to learn morality from any external source. I can know it within myself, as opposed to heteronymous morality, which is predicated upon the thesis that I need to be taught what constitutes morality. I feel compelled to note that although this is not a direct corollary of the distinction between autonomous morality and heteronymous morality, there is another adversarial pair that should be put on the table at this point as well, and that is whether we regard morality as essentially absolute or relative. Of what relevance is that to autonomous morality versus heteronymous morality? Well, if the premise is that I can conceive of what constitutes morality on my own, without the need for recourse to someone else who will tell me what it is, then on some plane, implicitly, there's such a thing as absolute morality. Granted, each of us is going to, if you will, impinge upon that. But in as much as we are all endowed essentially with the intellect that enables us to conceive of what constitutes morality and what is contrary to that moral system, then the implications of autonomous morality on some plane implicitly are an absolute system of morality. That doesn't necessarily mean everything is part of that absolute system of morality, but there exists some moral absolute. As opposed to, of course, if we regard morality as something that is inescapably heteronomous. The only way I know what moral is because someone tells me. Then it's possible to still posit a system of absolute morality, but we can well appreciate that under such circumstances, there's grounds for arguing that what will constitute for any individual what is moral is what his training dictated. So someone has one teacher that will impart to him one system of morality. Another person has a different teacher imparting a different system of morality, and morality becomes something relative. I'm stressing this point because, on some plane, we might be inclined to think that morality ought to be heteronomous. Don't we get it from the Torah? And it's important for us to appreciate that, if anything, that would tend in the direction of a relative morality. Again, not inexorably. It's important for us to appreciate the point. But I think we all intuitively grasp that the proposition that morality is relative puts us on veritably a slippery slope toward moral bankruptcy. And indeed, the premise, from our perspective, is that there is such a thing as an absolute code of morality. Exactly what components will go into that code, we still need to address. I think we already have an intuitive sense of where this is leading. And to that extent, the bedrock that underlies that absolute system necessarily is, at the very least, potentially autonomous, meaning I may learn it from an external source, but I need not learn it from an external source because I can also intuit it on my own. Abraham's statement certainly indicates that morality should be deemed autonomous. And of course, it's more for us to stress. This is the Abraham with respect to whom God said just a few verses earlier, now, there is tzivui. I know Abraham is going to command his children and his household after him to keep the way of God, to do tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and justice. And of course, he's going to command this system of justice, which you might well argue carries the adversarial proposition that it's heteronomous. Abraham is going to be communicating to his children and his household what constitutes justice and what does not. And again, I'm going to reiterate the crucial point here. The question is not whether we can teach morality and alternatively learn morality from another. The question is whether we need to. In other words, we certainly, as responsible parents, would never think of abandoning our children without any moral guidance, without teaching them what constitutes right and wrong. But that doesn't imply that morality is necessarily heteronomous. We want to help them out in knowing what's right and wrong, but they should be able to figure it out on their own. And certainly, again, the first source of Abraham implies that. And by consequence, we know the Midrash indeed speaks of this as something that is meritorious on the part of Abraham. Abraham natal al hasachar. Abraham is rewarded for having done so. And we've noted this previously, that is, there is an underlying premise indeed that we all resonate with some moral system. We have in other contexts discussed the Midrash at the top of the screen, Midrash Tanchuma. Just summarize it very briefly. The underlying premise of the Midrash is that when God sends Moshe to Pharaoh, it's time for the unleashing of the plagues against the Egyptians. Except that God, so to speak, has a problem. The moment the plagues will be unleashed on the Egyptians, all the rank and file Egyptians will be complaining. Pharaoh sinned. We're innocent. Why are we suffering? And that argument against a perceived divine injustice was enough to stop the plagues cold. And then there's the whole story with the straw, that because of Pharaoh's decree, there's no straw. But why? Why did the people have to scatter themselves over the entire land of Egypt in order to find stubble for straw? Answer, says the Midrash, because when any of the slaves would go into the field of an Egyptian to gather the stubble that's left after the harvest, which of course no one needs, no one wants, no one uses, it's basically ownerless property, the Egyptians would come running after them with sticks and say, "Get out of my field." So they scattered themselves over the entire land of Egypt just in order to find stubble for straw. What torment, what gratuitous suffering. And of course, the point of the Midrash, and what's the consequence of this? Now the Egyptians have no claim of innocence because each and every one of them has become guilty through that extra ounce of cruelty in not allowing the slaves to gather the stubble for straw. For our purposes, the reason I stress this Midrash is, again, there is the underlying premise that if people can summon an argument that God is being unjust, it's a problem. It was enough to stop the plagues in their tracks until that problem was cast aside because of the circumstances that arose in the particular context here. But again, the premise that we don't merely, as it were, mimic divine action in defining what is justice. We have an inner sense of what constitutes justice, and we either implicitly or explicitly hold God to that gauge of justice versus injustice. And of course, on that basis, then, we appreciate the Midrash saying, just as Israel called tzaddikim righteous, so too the nations of the world. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid stressing this point that one should speak in praise of the righteous, both Jews and Gentiles. Again, the essential premise that no one has a monopoly on the wherewithal to be righteous. The Midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah telling us that if a person seeks to be righteous, even as a goy, a Gentile, he can. There's nothing that prevents him from being considered righteous. Indeed, in this other Midrashic passage in Midrash Tanchuma, that the nations of the world are magnifying God's name more than Israel because they aren't commanded, and nonetheless they're doing so. The question with respect to whether the command is a higher level or not, but in any case, certainly the premise that no one has a monopoly on righteousness. There is a well-known statement of Rambam in his famous epistle to Rabbi Shmuel Ibn Tibon, where he describes Aristotle as having attained the pinnacle of human understanding, except for someone who attained the level of prophecy. Obviously, Aristotle wasn't the prophet, but having attained the pinnacle of Da'at Ha'adam, it's important for us to appreciate that in Rambam, intellectual and spiritual are synonymous terms. So this is someone who has attained a level of spirituality. I'm not saying everyone agrees with respect to Aristotle. Ramban has extraordinarily harsh words with respect to Aristotle and his Torah commentary, in particular on the Se'il Azazel, but that's not germane for our purposes. Whether an individual will live up to the standard, of course, depends upon the circumstances of the individual. We're not getting into an ad hominem discussion here, but that is possible for a Gentile to attain the pinnacle of righteousness, the pinnacle of intellectual self-actualization. Small wonder then that the Midrash tells us in Tana Devei Eliyahu Rabbah with respect to Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. The Midrash is, as it were, a testimony of Eliyahu. Me'id ani alai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. I call heaven and earth to testify, whether Gentile or Israel, whether man or woman, whether male servant or maid servant. Hakol lefi ma'aseh she'oseh kach ruach hakodesh shora alav. Everyone in accordance with the deed that one does, so the Holy Spirit comes upon him. No exclusivity whatsoever. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, Rabbeinu Yosef Lublin, commenting on this midrash, indeed posits that this is predicated, of course, upon the construct of Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. We're not getting to that right now. As a distinct from prophecy, there may be an exclusivity that pertains to prophecy per se, but with respect to the Holy Spirit, the famous Baraita of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair tells us that attaining the level of piety, chasidut, brings one to the level of Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Well, the nations of the world can attain that level of piety. We have a construct called Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the pious of the nations of the world. So they can attain piety. They can also attain the Holy Spirit. And note, Hakol lefi ma'aseh she'oseh, everyone in accordance with the deed that one does. To whatever extent, through one's actions, one attains that level, indeed, one attains the Holy Spirit. Now, this brings us to a broader discussion upon which we have impinged in the past, but now it needs to be far more a central focus, and that is what this implies, tells us, with respect to the Noachide commandments. And the first place that we look in this regard is Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer. Now, we've noted this in the past, at least off the cuff, but on the one hand, if we ask ourselves, in how many places in all of Talmudic literature is there a connection enunciated between attaining the status of pious of the nations of the world, which explicitly is associated with the share in the world to come, and keeping the Noachide commandments? In all of Talmudic literature, answer, 0. That is, the construct of Chasid Umot HaOlam is something we definitely find explicitly in the Talmud, and the concept of the 7 Noachide commandments we also find explicitly in the Talmud. Just there's no connection between them. If you will, in Tractate Sanhedrin, the discussion of Chasid Umot HaOlam, having a share in the world to come, is on page 105a, and the discussion of the Noachide commandments is on page 56, 56a, 56b, completely unrelated passages. The only place where we do find a connection between the pious of the nations of the world and keeping the Noachide commandments is in this extraordinarily obscure midrash called Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer, not to be confused with the very well-known midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, completely different midrash. Indeed, this midrash was really only published as a published work relatively recently, but what is, of course, of utmost significance with respect to this obscure midrash is we'll be getting to Rambam's ruling in Hilchot Melachim, Laws of Kings, chapter 8, Halacha 11. Rambam based himself on this midrash. How do we know? Because he writes it in a respondent to the students of Rabbeinu Ephraim. This is an extraordinary example of a place where we know the basis of Rambam's ruling. Okay, without getting into the details right now, I want to try to do things in some modicum of order. What does this midrash tell us? First of all, it stresses that while with respect to the pious of Israel, one is not called pious unless one keeps the entire Torah with respect to the pious of the nations of the world, as long as they do the 7 Noachide commandments in all their details, they're considered Hasidim. They're considered pious. But now the Midrash adds an additional dimension. This additional dimension, which is likewise preserved in Rambam's ruling, is absolutely critical in our addressing that question that still is lurking in the wings about whether morality is autonomous or heteronymous. Says the Midrash, this only works, that is, the status of being considered one of the pious of the nations of the world, and by consequence of that, having a share in everlasting life, if they keep the 7 Noachide commandments, and they say they're doing so because God commanded their forefather Noach to keep them. The Rambam slightly modifies the condition here and says they're keeping them because it is part of the corpus of Torah. That's to do with the basis of any imperative to keep a commandment. That has to be through the prophecy of Moshe. We'll put a parenthesis on that statement for now. But they need to state that they're keeping the mitzvot is because of this divine command, and then they will have a share in the world to come, just like Israel, Midrash says. Even though they're not keeping Shabbat or holidays, they weren't commanded to keep them, it's fine. But if they keep these commandments because they say, someone else told us, not from a divine source, and we'll stress in particular, one of the possibilities is, Omidat atzman shekachadat machrat, that they're keeping these commandments of their own mind because the mind determines that one should keep them. Then the Midrash says they only get their reward in this world, not in the world to come. But that means that there's the possibility of keeping these commandments because the mind determines that one should keep them. In other words, the premise that underlies this statement is, says the Midrash, the system of the Noachide commandments can indeed be an autonomous system of morality. Of course, it need not be. You can learn it from a divine source, which the Midrash emphasizes is a higher level. But we're not asking if it's possible to learn them. We're asking if it's possible to intuit them. And the Midrash says yes, because it's possible to do them because of the determination of the mind. In other words, if we ask ourselves, is there an autonomous system of morality distinct from Torah that dictates right and wrong? The answer to the Midrash is clearly, these are it. We'll note further with respect to the corpus of the Noachide commandments that the Gemara derives the Noachide commandments from what is admittedly a rather bizarre source. The source is the divine command to Adam. God's command to Adam that gives him license to eat of all the trees in the garden except the tree of knowing good and evil. And then there's an exposition that links the various words of this command to the Noachide commandments. If you ask me, why do they try to do this with this verse about eating of the trees of the garden and not eating of the tree of knowing good and evil? The obvious answer, because this is the first instance in which a human being receives a divine command. So it becomes a template for receiving a divine command. But if anything, we should note the observation of Rav Saadia Gaon in his philosophical magnum opus, Ha'emunot V'Adayot, that the cursory manner in which the Noachide commandments are intimated in this verse with a word or a very terse verbal expression is because they are intellectually mandated. And you don't need a lot of verbiage in order to be able to get at that. It's something that, again, is an intuitive verity. In much the same vein, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, at the end of the third treatise of Sefer HaKuzarei, relates to this exposition, linking the words of this verse with the 7 Noachide commandments explicitly as asmachta. What does asmachta mean? If we translate asmachta literally, it means the leaning of something. That is, you have a principle, you lean it on a biblical verse. To what end? There are different views among the Rishonim, the early rabbinic commentators on this score. We're not going to get into that right now, but certainly as far as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is concerned, this, he states explicitly, is a mnemonic device. That is, Samchim otah b'pasuk hazeh b'siman shemekel alehem zichram. It's simply a memory device. In other words, so if you ask, so what is the essential basis of the Noachide commandments? Ultimately, inevitably, the answer is you just know it. Now, you do get them from God, but you have that intuitive sense of right and wrong that dictates the Noachide commandments. I'll note that while what I'm about to say, I believe is wrong. At one point, I viewed the Noachide commandments as the, if you will, biblical Hebraic parallel of the concept of the Kantian rational imperative. The idea that is enunciated by Immanuel Kant, that we can define a system of morality that is dictated by reasoning. To be specific, if a particular mode of behavior were accepted by society at large, would that lead to the unraveling and destruction of society? If it would, then there's a rational imperative to not engage in that action. That applies, obviously, to murder. It applies to stealing. These would be an unraveling of all society. And to that extent, the idea that one would be able to intuit right and wrong is obviously a parallel that exists between the Kantian rational imperative and the Noachide covenant, except that it really doesn't. It might apply to, indeed, the prohibition on murder and the prohibition on stealing. That's part of the Noachide covenant. What does that have to do with the other mitzvot in the Noachide covenant? That is, to not engage in paganism, deifying that which is not divine, to not engage in blasphemy, cursing God in God's name, to not engage in sexual immorality, in eating a limb torn from a living animal. These aren't Kantian rational imperatives. So if we ask, what are they? We'll get to that answer in a moment. But we'll note that Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, in the Meshech Chochmah commentary on Torah Tzivah Lanu Moshe, posits that the Noachide commandments represent the preservation of order in society, and also coming to some concept of the Creator. If anything, Rabbi Baruch Epstein, in his Torah Tmimah, on 3 occasions in the Torah Tmimah, goes even further and says that the Noachide covenant is really only there for the preservation of society. Perhaps the strongest enunciation of this statement, that the Noachide commandments don't have in them af shemetz ruchaniut, even the faintest aspect of spirituality, merely societal preservation. Which, of course, again, sounds evocative of the Kantian rational imperative, except really not. Because the Kantian rational imperative is essentially to not be a criminal, to not engage in actions which, were they to proliferate throughout society, would lead to the undoing of society. Sheva mitzvot Noach go far beyond that. There's an underlying premise that there is in that inner, if you will, innate moral compass, a resonance with holiness. You need to instill holiness into your life, and that too is intuitive. And to the extent that it is intuitive, that system is indeed autonomous. You need to infuse holiness into your life on an interpersonal plane, which is why there's a prohibition on murder and on stealing, which are on an interpersonal plane. You need to infuse holiness into your life in your confrontation with the realm of the divine, the transcendent. And that's the reason that there's a prohibition on paganism, deifying what is not divine, and blasphemy, cursing God in God's name. And these two are an inner resonance, because it's not something you need to get from outside, and there isn't even an explicit insistence on believing in God, but don't deify what is not God. Don't curse God in God's name. If you believe in God, you shouldn't be cursing. If you don't believe in God, you shouldn't be cursing in his name. There's a certain absurdity there, and you need to get past that absurdity and infusing holiness into your life in your relationship with the transcendent. And finally, 3 vertices, 3 relationships that define life. One's relationship with himself, man, one's relationship with the transcendent, one's relationship with self. And likewise, to infuse holiness into one's relationship with self, those 2 domains in which a human being can act like an animal, self-preservation, that is food, preservation of the species, that means sex, are 2 domains in which you need to express your humanity. And so, with respect to sex, the prohibition on the forbidden sexual relationships, and with respect to food, the prohibition on eating a limb torn from a living animal. In fine, the totality of the 6 prohibitions of the Noachide covenant, there's a debate between Rambam and Ramban as it pertains to the 7th, exactly what the imperative of dinim is. We're not going to get into that right now, but in any case, when we consider in this vein the proposition of Rabbi Epstein that there's nothing spiritual about the Noachide commandments, do we agree or not? Truth is, my inclination would be to say, I think there is a dissension on this score, in that it depends on how you relate to society. Is society something that in itself has spiritual significance or not? For Rambam, it doesn't. Society is a technicality because there's no real world Robinson Crusoe. Everyone depends upon society in order to be able to meet his most basic existential needs. There's nothing spiritual about that. So society's preservation is not something that has intrinsic spiritual value. When does it become something spiritual? When you keep those mitzvot that provide for the preservation of society as an explicit act of divine service. That's what the Midrash said in Mishnah Rabbi Eliezer. That is likewise what Rambam states in the Laws of Kings, chapter 8, halacha 11, where he cites essentially the same idea, and says that one is considered one of the pious of the nations of the world only when one keeps the Noachide laws because of the divine command. But if one keeps them mipnei hechrea hada'at, because of the determination of the mind, then that doesn't make a person into one of the pious of the nations of the world. It makes the person into one of the sage, the chachamim of the nations of the world. And it doesn't provide a basis for having a share in the world to come either. And by consequence, we note, first of all, again, Rambam is citing almost verbatim what the Midrash said about hechreah hadat, determination of the mind. One can come to the Noachide laws to the determination of the mind. And of course, simultaneously, it doesn't make one into one of the pious of the nations of the world, because for that, you need to have some sense of divinity in what you're doing, as opposed to merely societal preservation, because societal preservation by itself doesn't have any spiritual import from Rambam's perspective at all. I'll note something we discussed previously as well. When we ask for additional evidence that the Noachide covenant is something that is accessible as an autonomous system of morality, that one need not be trained in it, we consider the thrust of the statement in the Gemara, also in Tractate Sanhedrin, that in the Noachide covenant, we've noted this previously, one is considered culpable with one judge and one witness without forewarning. So, of course, as we already noted, that aspect of forewarning as an imperative is something that pertains exclusively to those who are beholden to keeping the Torah. Is the Torah a system of autonomous morality that can be intuited on one's own? Absolutely not. No one will claim that. And of course, to that extent, then, in order to be considered culpable with respect to violation of the Torah, we have to check to make sure that you know what the Torah says. So, as we've noted, even with respect to something like a prohibition on murder, we have to make sure that you know the Torah also says lo tirtzach. If you are beholden not to your innate sense of morality, but rather to what the Torah dictates. With respect to that innate moral sense with which we are endowed, Israel at Sinai bludgeoned that innate moral sense into submission because of the might of the experience of God's revelation. Everyone else is still beholden to that native sense of right and wrong with which we are endowed. There's no need of forewarning. So there's no such thing as shogeg, as I didn't know with respect to the Noachide covenant, because everyone is considered duty-bound to know that there is a standard of morality. And again, that standard of morality isn't just Kantian moral imperatives. The standard of morality is you have an intuitive sense of holiness and you resonate with that sense of holiness. That's with respect to one witness and no forewarning. What about one judge? Well, we need to consider why we always insist upon there being more than one judge. The first Mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin tells us Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha, that monetary disputes require 3 judges. Why 3 judges? Why isn't one enough? And the answer the Gemara gives on this Mishnah is because even if we're speaking of 3 laymen who aren't trained, when you have 3 laymen together, it's impossible that you won't have one who knows the right rules. Knows the right rules, as Rashi expresses it, that is, who has learned, who has been taught right and wrong according to Torah law. You can't intuit that on your own. You need to be taught. You need to learn it. That's, of course, with respect to a court that adjudicates based upon the Torah. Not so with respect to a court that adjudicates based upon the Noachide covenant. You don't need to be taught. You know it intuitively. So one judge is sufficient. I think inexorably that's the thrust of that ruling. And it's important for us to note that we have ample sources among the Rishonim, the earlier rabbinic commentators, that do not require that additional condition of keeping the Noachide covenant because of a divine command. Here's one example. Oops, this is at least attributed to Rambam. But I noted here Hamyucheset la Rambam. In this epistle that is attributed to Rambam, Rambam doesn't say anything about the condition of keeping them because of the command to Moshe. Indeed, Rambam speaks of essentially a level of moral decency without even quantifying it beyond the quantification of the Gemara. Chasidei Olam, pious of the nations of the world, have a share in the world to come, and it doesn't necessarily have to be based upon the fidelity to the Noachide covenant altogether. Of course, we regard this as a somewhat questionable source because the attribution to Rambam is very shaky. It may be a forgery. But the truth of the matter is that we should note that from Rambam's perspective as well, it's clear that keeping the Noachide covenant is not the sole route to having a share in the world to come. We already noted the example of Aristotle. Aristotle reaches the pinnacle of human intellectual / spiritual achievement. You don't think he had a share in the world to come according to Rambam? I think he did. Moreover, in the third unit of the guide of Maran Avuchim, in chapter 51, Rambam famously gives you a very involved allegory for getting into the throne room with the king. And there's one course to get into the throne room. It starts out with the Amei Haaretz, the ignorant who are keeping mitzvot, and the next level up is the Talmudists who believe in correct theological principles based upon what they were taught, and then from there to an understanding of theology, Chokhmat Elokut. There's another course. The other course goes through logic and mathematics to a mastery of natural science to theology. And you know, it has nothing to do with Torah and mitzvot. It seems clear that Rambam is describing a course that gets one into the throne room without being part of Israel. The throne room. Someone who gets into the throne room certainly has a share in the world to come, unimpeachably. So if you ask, what are we to make of what Rambam states in Laws of Kings, chapter 8, halacha 11? The answer very simply is that Rambam is talking about under the circumstance that one is appealing to a share in the world to come because of fidelity to the Noachide covenant, then we have to make sure that you were spiritual acts and you were doing it because of your fidelity to the divine command. But there are other ways to get into the world to come as well. In any case, there's certainly ample sources in the Rishonim that don't require any additional heteronymous aspect. Famously, Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi of Mitz in Sefer Yereim speaks only of keeping the 7 Noachide laws without talking about the basis for having done so. And the Karnei Reim commentator on Sefer Yereim indeed posits that he is in dissent with Rambam. We'll note that, likewise, the Divrei Chaim Tzanzer talks about the requirement for Israel to have all these extra mitzvot because we have a certain character trait. The Gemara says that the Torah was given to Israel because we are azim, we're brazen. And the nations of the world don't have that attribute of brazenness, and as a result, they don't need all these other mitzvot. I'll note that Rav Kook in Igeret, in the epistle, Igrot Re'ayah, in grappling with the aforementioned halacha in Rambam, again, Laws of Kings, chapter 8, halacha 11, makes the proposition that maybe when Rambam describes the difference between the pious of the nations of the world and the sage, the wise of the nations of the world, really the latter are on an even higher level than the sages, than the pious of the nations of the world. The truth of the matter is, I am not convinced that Rav Kook's reading works in Rambam, all the more so what we know that Rav Kook could not have known, that Rambam was explicitly ruling based upon Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer. There are circumstances in which the pious are on a higher level than the sage. But what certainly is true is we're speaking of a course that can enable an individual to attain a share in everlasting life. And again, something that represents a completely distinct and separate course from the fidelity to Torah and mitzvot that applies to Israel. As an underlying source for that, I'll appeal likewise to what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi states in the first treatise of Sefer HaKuzari, in considering why we are obligated to keep the Torah as opposed to all the other nations of the world. And while Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes more than one point in section 25, what I'm going to stress is that our obligation to keep the Torah, says he, is because of the experience of the Exodus. Again, the innate moral sense was bludgeoned into submission. It is not because we were created by God, because had we been created by God, then the obligation to keep mitzvot would be identical for Israel and for the nations of the world, which is indeed exactly the case. Obligation to keep the Torah is not by virtue of creation. Simultaneously, we'll stress a point that is made by Rabbi Yosef Albo in Sefer HaIkarim, and likewise by Rabbi Meir ben Kabai in Avodat HaKodesh, and that is that we have these two separate pathways. The Torah of Moshe that gives Israel its course to everlasting life, and the Torah of Noach that gives the nations of the world their course to everlasting life. They're two parallel tracks, and they both work because there are different routes given to these two groups. And we certainly indeed regard there as being an alternative course to Torah in order to be able to become spiritually vital and have a share in everlasting life. We'll note further an idea that is enunciated by Maharal in Ber HaGolah. He is here relating to the proposition that is made in the Gemara that Adam was the one who first engaged in the hybridizing of a horse and a donkey to produce a mule, which is, of course, something that is forbidden according to Torah law. One is not allowed to combine different species. And yet the Gemara seems to be lauding Adam for having done this. And the thrust of Maharal's conclusion, this is more complex than we're going to be addressing right now, because there is a question with respect to the extent to which there is a prohibition of interbreeding for Gentiles. But what Maharal stresses is the Torah gives us one course to perfect and refine the world. And that, of course, is a course that demands of us fidelity to all the commandments of the Torah. But there's another course. And the other course is a course that pertains to the nations of the world as well, such that at the end of the passage, there's a course that goes via Torah, there's a course that goes via the process of refining, completing the world, and it doesn't necessarily go through Torah. And it applies, of course, to the nations of the world as well. As one final dimension that we'll note with respect to this unit, there is, of course, the well-known principle enunciated by Hillel in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot, Lo Am Haaretz Chasid. The pious is a level that is excluded from the ignorant. And in context, of course, the Am Haaretz, the ignoramus, is one who is ignorant of Torah. And why is he incapable of attaining this level of chassidut? Well, of course, to that end, we need to define just what constitutes chassidut. Chassidut, as we've noted in other contexts, is characterized by lifnim mishurat adin. How do we translate lifnim mishurat adin into simple English? It's a trick question. The answer is we can't. Lifnim mishurat adin is usually translated into English as going beyond the letter of the law, which is such a travesty. Lifnim doesn't mean beyond, it means within. That is, a more rigorous rendering of lifnim mishurat adin into English would be to read, so to speak, between the lines. So there are those who can only read the lines, and there are those who get such a sense of what the lines are telling you that they read between the lines as well. That's the chassid. The ignoramus can be tzaddik, because tzaddik, after all, is characterized by tzedek, justice. And the ignoramus can resonate with what justice is. But to be able to read between the lines, you got to know what the lines are saying. You have to know Torah. The ignorant cannot attain that level of chassidut, and moreover, we sure hope they won't even try. Why not? Well, this is an idea that is enunciated by the Gemara. Im am haaretz hu chasid al tadu b'shchonato. If you have an ignoramus who is pious, don't be his neighbor. It could be dangerous. There is an oxymoronic construct that we find enunciated in the Mishnah in Tractate Sotah, the Chassid Shoteh. We can render that as a pious fool who has this conception of going beyond the letter of the law, and I'm deliberately translating that way, and ends up in violation of the Torah. That is, he hears a woman drowning in a river, and he doesn't want to hear the sound of a woman's voice, so he shuts off his ears and lets her drown. Chas v'chalila. That's the antithesis of Torah. But you know where it comes from? It comes from thinking that the Torah is an autonomous system that I can intuit. To know the system of Torah, I need to study the Torah. There is an autonomous system of morality. It's called the Noachide covenant. It's not Torah. And this is the first threshold that we need to negotiate in our answering the question, the title question of this whole exercise, which of course, again, we reiterate, is does the Torah determine what morality is, or do we? Religious belief versus human responsibility. The Torah doesn't determine what morality is. The Torah is a different system. There is a system that constitutes a social and rational imperative, but it's distinct from the Torah. It's called the Noachide covenant. And that then is the first threshold for us to negotiate in considering what the relationship between Torah and morality is.